morning. Our learning is Lila Nishmas Mintel Mariam Bas Kamen Ruvain, her Neshama Shavan Aliyah. Okay, we are at Nen Testament Aleph at the top of the page of Yochanan Amar. It's about 3 lines down, and short Amud, but not such an easy one. So the last thing we saw was this question about this bell. The clapper was taken out. So we said, how could it still maintain its status as tamei without the clapper? If you remove the clapper, it doesn't have its function. So the Gemara answered, Rava answered Rava answered that the reason it still has a status of tamei is because the bell could still make noise. How does it make noise? Not by ringing it, but rather because the bell could be hit against an earthenware pot and still make noise. So basically the bell still has a function of making noise. However, Rav Yochanan Amar, Hoil v'ra'oi legamea bo mayim letinok. The reason that the bell still has its status as tamei is because although without the clapper it can make noise, but at the end of the day it still has a function. What could it be done? It can be made into a cup, a small cup. We're talking about presumably a very small bell, and you turn it over, and it's a cup, right? Okay, so therefore it's still, even though granted it's missing its clapper, but it still has a function. Now, obviously you see there's a difference between Rava and Rav Yochanan. Rava was telling us that it still has a function that it still makes a musical sound, right? Or it still makes a sound, that it still could make noise because you could bang it against something else. Whereas Rav Yochanan is telling us it still has a function that it can be used to feed someone, to use as a cup, but it doesn't have its original function. And the Gemara is going to be troubled by that because Rav Yochanan, we are going to see, does necessitate that for something to maintain its status as tamei, it has to have some of its original function. Okay, that's going to be the Gemara's now discussion, that for something to maintain its status as tamei, it's not enough that it has a function, it has to have its original function. Yeah, that's going to be the discussion. We've had this concept has come up a little bit. Yeah, we've had this concept come up a little bit. Okay. Rav Yochanan labai me'ei malacha rishona. Is it so that Rav Yochanan does not require the utensil to have somewhat of the original function? Vatanya, we learned as follows. V'chol hakli asher yeshav alav. Okay, so there is a pasuk that speaks about tamei midras. Tamei midras is basically tuma where someone sits upon something. It's a tuma. It's a type of impurity that is limited to situations where someone had an emission, whether it's a zav, zava, nida. In those cases, a person who has that this type of emission, they're able to transfer tumah by sitting on something, even when they don't sit directly on something. But let's say you have like a mattress and a sheet and a blanket and a pillow, and the person's sitting up high, but since they ultimately are sitting on that mattress is going to be in tamei. Anything they sit upon is going to assume tamei, tumas midras. Okay, so the Gemara, the Brisa now continues about this tumah of tumas midras. It says yachal kafa sa'a v'yashvaleh. Let's say a person zav took a barrel which is used to fill it with whatever wine, oil, whatever it is, and the zav flipped it over and sat on it. Now that barrel is not a chair, but he made it into a chair. Or kafa tarkav yashvaleh, he's flipped over a smaller barrel, okay, whatever, different sized barrels, and sat upon it. Yachli tamei, you may think that it's going to be tamei. Tamalomar sher yeshev alav. The pasuk says any utensil which the zav will sit. Now it should have said any utensil which the zav sat upon, but it switches to the future tense. It says any utensil that the zav will sit upon. What does that mean? Mishum yuchal shiva, meaning the fact that it says which he will sit or she will sit implies that it's only going to be on something that is fit for sitting. Yatzazeh she'omrim lo amod v'nasa malachtenu. Excluding this thing where the zav might be sitting on it and someone may come by and say, hey, get up because I need that thing for something other than sitting. Get up so I could use this container for its regular function. The fact that it says that he will sit implies that it's something that has to be that he'd be able to continue sitting on even if someone needs it, even if someone comes along, as opposed to something where someone comes along and says, hey, I need this thing for something else, right? So that's the what we're learning from the future tense. It's not enough that he once sat upon it. It has to be something that he could, so to speak, continue sitting on, as opposed to something where we might say, tap him on the shoulder, say, get off of this thing because we need it for something else. Right? So fine. So basically we learn for tumas midras that it has to be something which the person could stay sitting on. Okay? So far so good. That's not yet relevant to what we're discussing. However, after quoting this brisa, we have machlokas amoraim between Rav Elazar and Yochanan about this brisa. Rav Elazar omer b'midrasos omrim amod v'nas malachtenu. Okay? By tumas midras we say stand up and let us do a work. Ve'ein omrim b'tmei meis amod v'nas malachtenu. Okay, but we don't say this same principle by tumas meis. What does that mean? What that means is that Rav Elazar says this principle is limited to a situation where someone who is a zava nida sits down on this thing, and we say, is it something which maintains its function as a seat or not? But we do not take that same principle and apply it to the following case, where let's say this utensil became tamei, and then we go ahead and use it for something else. right? Then we do the fact that's right. The fact that this thing, this tumas mace, this mace comes into contact with this item, and a person then goes ahead and uses it or uses it for a different function. Okay, as long as it still has its function as a regular utensil, we're still going to say it has its tumah. Okay, so basically we're now using this principle, this pasuk, teach us something which is not exactly relevant to Tumas Medras. Rabbi Elazar is saying that this principle is limited to Tumas Medras. Whereas if you have something where it becomes tameh, and now is going to be used for something else, it still has some function, but not its original function, it will still maintain its tumah. It will still maintain its tumah. Let's see the contrast. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Af Omer B'Tmei Meis Amud V'Nas Malachtenu. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, we learn from this pasuk that if something was tameh, and it was being used for some function, and then I go ahead and I no longer use it for its original function, but it still is, it's no longer used for its original function, then it maintains its, if it's no longer used for its original function, then it loses its status as tameh. It loses its status as tameh. So you see from Rav Yochanan, from this brisa, the way he learns it, is that as long as it's no longer used for its original function, then it's going to lose its tumah status, right? So basically, Rav Yochanan and Rav Elazar are arguing about this exact principle that we just saw about the bell. Rav Yochanan is saying that if something was being used for one function, and then I go ahead and I use it for a different function, but not similar to its original function, right? Now I know no longer usable for its original function, and now it's going to be used for something else. Okay, then it loses its status. Then it's going to lose its status as tameh. Whereas Rav Yochanan over here by the bell said it was originally a bell making noise, and now I'm using it no longer usable for that function. It's using for something else, and he says it's still maintaining its status of tumah. So on the one hand, you have this later teaching, this other teaching which we just saw, where Rav Yochanan tells us it has to maintain its original status, and whereas by the bell he says as long as it maintains any function, even if it's not its original function. With me? Yeah. Stira, contradiction. Gemara asks the easy answer. Ibach Kamaisa, reverse the original rulings. Remember, we had Rava and Rav Yochanan, two different opinions about why the bell maintains its original status. Rava said it maintains its original status because you could bang it against earthenware. Rav Yochanan said it maintains its tameh because it can be used as a cup. So now they switch it around. Rav Yochanan was the one who said it maintains its tumah because it still can be used to bang against something else. And therefore, it's consistent. Rav Yochanan is the one who tells us that as long as something maintains its original status as tameh, therefore it's going to be, therefore it maintains its status of tumah. But if it goes ahead and it changes from its original status function, and it no longer has its original function, even though it has a function, Rav Yochanan would say it's not going to be able to come tameh. Okay? And the Gemara asks, as it always does when we have this, right? We had two scenarios where there was a contradiction of Rav Yochanan. There's two cases where there are debates between other Amoraim. Why are you switching the first one? Switch the second one. In other words, what gave you the indication to switch the first one, where I want to switch the second one? So the Gemara answers, Hashamina le Rav Yochanan debayim e'emalach rishon. Because we hear elsewhere, there's another scenario where we hear that Rav Yochanan tells us that it has to have its semblance of its original function in order to maintain its tumah status, and that's why we went ahead and switched the first one. Meaning that's why we wanted to say Rav Yochanan was the one who said that the bell without its clapper, that's the reason it's tameh is because it could still make noise and not because it could be used as a cup. Okay, what's that brisa what's that teaching that tells us that Rav Yochanan holds that it has to maintain its original function? The Tanya, we have a brisa. So just review. We said animal items do not become tameh. Right? Animal items not become tameh. That was the principle. Was human items become tameh. Human clothing becomes tameh. Animal clothing typically does not become tameh. However, the brisa says sandal shebehema shamatachas tameh. The metal shoe of an animal is susceptible to tumah. Okay, so why is that? The Gemara asks, what is its function? In what way is this shoe fit for a human person, for a human? Rav says, if let's say you're in the middle of war and you need a cup and you're with your animal, so you take off its shoe and use it as a cup. Okay, you and I may not do so, but whatever, this is what was done. Okay, Reb Chanina Amar, if a person needs to pour oil on themselves during a war, okay, they have a wound or whatever it is, they'll use the shoe, which is a container, and they'll pour oil. Right? We're just giving different examples to why this shoe, although it seems like it's an animal piece of clothing, it still has a human function. Rav Yochanan Amar, if a person's running from the battle, okay, manicha baraglav, they'll place the animal shoe on their own feet, Viratz al kotzin v'al barkanim, and that will enable them to run over thorns and thistles. In other words, it's hard to run, but if you have a metal shoe, you're not going to worry about running over. Thorns and thistles. Now, you notice Rav Yochanan specifically gave an example where its function is one of its original function, right? So it's that same principle, right? It's not exactly the same case because we're not talking about a scenario where it's tameh and it's maintaining its tumah, but you see this idea that Rav Yochanan necessitates maintaining its original function in the context of tumah. Whereas Rav Chanina said, no, it could be used to pour cups of water, it can be used for oil, right? That's not its original function. Its original function is a shoe for an animal. Rav Yochanan says, no, in order for it to be tameh, it has to maintain its original function. Again, I want to repeat, it's not exactly the same case because what we're talking about over here is something that's tameh, and we want to maintain its tameh status, and we say in order to maintain its tameh status, Rav Yochanan says it has to maintain its original function. Here we're talking about, it's not changing, we're asking, is this shoe able to come tameh in general? And Rav Yochanan says the only way it's able to come tameh is because it's still able to, the human thing it's able to do is of its original function. But the Ritva says it's similar enough that we see Rav Yochanan holds of this principle that in order for tumah, it has to maintain its original function. Okay? Fine. Now the Gemara asks, "My bain Rav Rabbi Chanina." What's the difference between Rav and Rabbi Chanina's approach? Right? In other words, one said it's used for drinking water. One says it's used for pouring oil. If you're gonna, the difference would be if it's dirty. In other words, if it's a dirty shoe, you would not use it for water. You might still use it for oil. Okay, right, fine. My bain, I'm bain Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Chanina, Ika benayu di yakir. And what's the difference between Rabbi Chanina and Rabbi Yochanan? In other words, let's say it's dirty. What's the difference between Rav Yochanan's answer of saying I could use it to run and Rav Chanina who says it's for oil? The difference would be diakir. If it's a very heavy shoe, depends how thin the metal is. If it's very heavy metal, then if your goal is to run away, granted it might save you from the thorns and thistles, but you're not going to wear a very heavy shoe on running away from battle. You're not going to use it, and therefore in such a case it would not be susceptible to tumah if it's very heavy. But if it's just being used for pouring oil, you would still use it. I'm just going to pause because before we just see the next Gemara, we get into a lot of tumah and tara when it comes to Masechah Shabbos. There's a lot of tangents. I think, not that I can't say this definitively, but I think much more than other Masechtos, I believe, that you find these tangents. And on the one hand, it's a little challenging. There's a glazed look. I see the glazed look when it comes to tumah and tara. But I imagine that part of the idea is that tumah has like numerous levels of stringency around it. Like we take tumah very seriously, and because of that we have there's tumah, what's original deraisa, then there's like layer after layer after layer of stringency, of gezeros, of decrees, in order to ensure that we do not mess around with tumah. And you find a lot of those same principles when it comes to Shabbos, when it comes to the laws of Shabbos, because we take Shabbos so seriously, we also have layers of decrees. In other words, you have certain laws where you don't have the same level of so my point is that there's some similarity over there in terms of some of the principles that, let's say, I'm just trying to think of another halacha, another isser, that you don't find, it's certainly sure you'll find there's many more levels of decrees around it, whereas others you don't. The Maharal in Baragola says that certain halachos are like the eye, certain halachos like the finger, right? So my finger is protected by my nail, but it's okay. It's just a nail, right? My nail, the function of my nail is to protect my finger from when I hit things, when I touch things, I'm moving things. I'm not going to hurt my finger all the time because it is protected by the nail, right? But my eye has like a billion layers of protection. It has whatever, it has the lash and eyebrow and whatever, all the different things we have, and the eyelid, all those things, because the eye is so sensitive. Because not because it's so sensitive, because it has such an integral function, it has many more layers of protection. So whenever you see an isser which has many layers of prohibitions, on the one hand you say, okay, this is like a lot. What's going on over here? At the same time, to recognize we're dealing with something incredibly precious. Tumah and Shabbos both have something very precious about it, and both of them are therefore going to have many layers of protection. On the one hand, it's a lot. On the one hand, it's hard to keep track of. At the same time, to recognize, there's a lot of complexity. Just like there's a lot of complexity around my eye, as opposed to my finger, we're dealing with laws that are beruma shel olam. We're dealing with laws which are so incredibly significant, and that's why you have all these layers of decree. And both Tumah and Shabbos both have similar constructs in the sense that they're both eyes. When it comes to the laws of Torah, Shabbos, Tumah, they are the eyes of the laws of our laws, whereas other halachos are perhaps more our fingers, other parts of our body which don't need the same protection. But it's because Shabbos is so precious and Tumah is so precious precious that it has all these levels of decree. Sometimes hard to follow, sometimes hard to hold in our head, but that's, I think, the principle behind it. Okay, let's go a little bit further. Okay, now we're back to carrying on Shabbos. The Mishnah said a woman cannot wear a city of gold. Okay, so what is a city of gold? My be'ir shel zav, Rabba bar Barchana Amar Rav Yochanan, Yerushalayim Zahav. It refers to a city of Yerushalayim, a gold ornament that was a city of Yerushalayim. Okay, says the Gemara in Nun Testament base, the ornament that Rabbi Kiva made for his wife. What is this referring to? We know Rabbi Kiva married the daughter of Kalba Savua. Kalba Savua was incredibly wealthy. His name was Kalba Savua. Literally means a satisfied dog. Okay, why was he called a satisfied dog? It was his nickname because you'd come to his house as a hungry dog, very, very hungry, and you'd leave as a satisfied dog. In other words, he was a big Baal Chesed. He was incredibly generous, and his daughter fell in love with Rabbi Kiva. Rabbi Kiva was a shepherd for his father. His daughter fell in love with him. He was poor, he was ignorant, and yet she saw something in him, and he excommunicated her. He said, "What are you doing?" He didn't want her to marry him. He didn't think that she was that they were an appropriate fit, and therefore he excommunicated her. And they were living in absolute poverty. Right? There's famous Gemaras about the incredible poverty that they were living in. They had absolutely nothing. He used to go ahead. The Gemara says that they used to sleep in straw in like in the barn. They used to sleep in straw. They didn't have a house. They used to sleep in straw. And like every morning, Rabbi Kiva would pick out the straw pieces of hair, the straw from her hair, in the morning, because this is what they had. They had nothing. And used to promise her that one day I'm gonna buy you a city of gold. I'm taking out these straw from your hair. One day I'm gonna give you like an ornament for your hair. Things are gonna be different. And of course, eventually, things are different. The Gemara tells us in the Darim that Kalba Savua not only took her out of the will, he took a vow that he would not give her any money. He made a neder. And the Gemara tells us that one day Rabbi Kiva was like traveling, and Kalba Savua went and visited him. He didn't know who he was. And he comes to this great scholar and he says, whatever, basically have a whole discussion. Bottom line is he gets him, he annuls the vow is annulled because he didn't realize Rabbi Kiva could have been as great as he is. The Gemara actually, in that same Gemara, talks about the fact that a person makes a vow about a person being, I'm trying to remember the exact terminology now, I'm sorry. What does it say? Basically, the point is that, the assumption that someone can't be a Talmid Chacham, like there's no such thing. In other words, every person has the capacity to be a great scholar, and there's no way of like saying like, any vow of like this person cannot be a scholar, like that's not such a vow, because every person has the ability to become a someone who is completely learned. Look at us, we're learning Amud Yomi. The point is that everyone has the capacity to be absolute Talmid Chachamim. The bottom line is he ultimately annuls the vow, and he reunites with his daughter, he reunites with Rabbi Kiva. He doesn't realize the scholar he's talking to is Rabbi Kiva, and Rabbi Kiva ultimately goes ahead and buys her the city of gold, and that's the ornament that we're talking about, and that's why the Gemara references it over here. This is the city of gold, and it can't be worn. It can't be worn on Shabbos. It obviously could be worn during the week. You should be bothered because we saw earlier that this idea that once the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, you're not supposed to wear these crowns. So the Mefarshim explain that it's only a kala that can't wear the crown, because a kala wearing this crown, like that's like the height of joy, the height of beauty and the height of joy, like that's too much. But a regular person, when it's not a wedding, to wear a golden ornament that looks like Yerushalayim, that is not forbidden, and that's why he buys his wife this thing, and that's can't be worn on Shabbos. Okay, good. So again, over Yom Tov, by the way, again, first day before Mincha, second day, 7 o'clock to 7:20 in the youth lounge is what we're going to learn. Let's learn a little bit from Rav Dessler. He has another piece. This piece he writes. Again, this is one of the essays that he writes in the beginning of it's in 1940. The war broke out. His students are all over the place, and he basically writes this essay out, and he sends it out to his students all over the world, all over Europe. He's not teaching them in person. They're all, hunkered down in different places, but this is an essay that he's writing them. So just to keep in mind the time and place that he's writing the essay, and he's a little bit, he actually speaks about the time and place a little bit more explicitly. He begins with a Mishnah in Perkei Avos that says that a person should always study Torah shelo lishma, shemitoch shelo lishma, ba lishma. Again, the pasuk says a person should always learn Torah shelo lishma. Shelo lishma means like not for altruistic purposes, meaning even if I'm doing it for self-serving purposes, shemitoch shelo lishma, through the lo lishma, I come to doing it lishma. Okay, so he quotes Reb Chaim Volozhin. It's not the first time he's quoted him. It's one of the most beautiful commentaries on Perkei Avos. It's called Ruach Chaim, and he says learning Torah shelo lishma is an important key to the stage when one comes to learn it lishma. Without this preparatory stage, one is incapable of combating the evil inclination. So this idea, normally we say, really we should be learning Torah lishma. I should be learning Torah for its proper purpose. But Rav Chaim Volozhin says no. It's not only that if you're stuck, you can learn Shelo Lishma. No. You must learn, and that's the terminology says. Le'olam, a person should always be learning Shelo Lishma, because through the Lo Lishma, you actually get to the Lishma. In other words, it's impossible to get to Lishma. It's impossible to get to learning for the ideal purpose, for altruistic purposes. You must go through learning it for ulterior purposes. Okay, and that's what he's going to be explaining how this works. Okay, how this works. But then he makes like a comment, like a side comment. He says, nowadays, there's no such thing as Shelo Lishma. It's almost like there's only, meaning he says historically, a person who was a scholar, the society would take care of them, would pay, would care for them, would provide for them. He says nowadays, he says in certain countries, it was, no one took Torah learning seriously anymore, and basically totally disregarded it. In the countries where it was taken seriously, the governments clamped down and did not allow them. He refers to communist Russia, where they made learning Torah impossible. He says the only people learning Torah nowadays, he says, are learning Lishma. He says there's no honor in learning Torah right now. He says where we're living, in the poverty we're living, in the distress we're living, he says the only learning is Lishma. And just like, again, it's like a sidebar, but it's a historic, important sidebar, just to recognize like the difficulties. So no one was learning because they're getting pats on the back. There were no pats on the back. To learn at that point was an incredibly altruistic act. Okay, but then he comes back to this idea of Lo Lishma and Lishma. He says, how does it work that Shelo Lishma leads to Lishma? And he says like this. He says that he says there are people who learn for ulterior motives, and they live their whole lives learning for ulterior motives, right? There are people who basically are doing it entirely for, they want to get the right shidduch, they want to do it so people appreciate them, they want to get it for honor, and they never graduate to the space of Lishma. So he quotes from his teacher of Simcha Zissel, who says that it has to be that even when we say that learn Shelo Lishma so you get to Lishma, it can't be that you're learning entirely for Shelo Lishma purposes. Rather, it must be that you are learning for, you want to get there. Like you want to be there. You want to be in a place where I'm doing it for the right reason. I recognize I'm not there, so you want to have some incentives. He used himself as an example. He says, this is amazing. He says, back in the day when I was a kid, every Friday night, my father, and he says his father, his uncle used to wake up at midnight. At midnight every Friday night, they used to go to sleep and wake up at midnight, and I'd wake up as well, and we learn Torah the entire from midnight on to the morning. My mother used to wake up as well. She would study Medrash, Ramban, and Malbim, not bad. And his mother would also go ahead and make latkes and hot cocoa. Okay, and he says, and she would go ahead and bring it. He says that was part of my thought when I jumped out of bed at midnight. That was part of my thought, something that incentivized me to get up and to go. But at the same time, it wasn't the only reason I was doing it. I really wanted to learn. It was exciting to learn. But at the same time, it helped. So he says, first of all, you have to realize when we say learn Shelo Lishma so you get to Lishma, it doesn't mean learn entirely for, so people will pat you on the back. So people say, wow, I learned Amud Yomi, I learned Daf Yomi, whatever it is. No, I should do it for the right reason. But to recognize that it's okay. It's appropriate to need incentives at this point. Okay, why is it important to need incentives? And now he goes on to explain that he says that when it comes to Avodas Hashem, we have to recognize that there is a ladder. Everything is a ladder. A person cannot jump. When you think of Avodas Hashem as a ladder, we recognize that it's impossible to simply jump to the top of the ladder. We can't do that. It's impossible. And to recognize that to get to Lishma is the top of a ladder, and the ladder in some way is a little bit more rickety at this place. That to recognize the top of the ladder is something which is much harder to get to, and to recognize the only way to properly get to the top of the ladder is to take those steps. It is impossible for a person to climb to the highest of heights when it comes to Avodas Hashem without going through the lower steps. And he says this is, and he says ironically or not so ironically, the person who is represented by the ladder is who? Is Yaakov. Yaakov Avinu sees that ladder of Avodas Hashem. According to the Ran, that ladder represents not, there are many different interpretations. The Ran's interpretation is the ladder represents the service of Hashem. To recognize that, right, the pasuk says, Olim v'yordim bo, that the angels are going up and down. He says that's the Avodas Hashem. The Avodas Hashem it's a ladder. It's a ladder to recognize that it's impossible. Sometimes we're filled with, maybe we've been inspired for a moment, we see something, we hear something, we say, I need to be at the top of the ladder. To recognize it is impossible. It is simply impossible when it comes to Avodas Hashem to simply be on the top. Rather, Olam v'yordim bo, there's the up, there's the down, there's the up, there's the down, and we have to recognize that even Yaakov, who is the man of truth, the person who doesn't have any toleration for anything which is less than the ideal, Hashem is dafka specifically telling him, yes, you're the man of truth. Yes, you're the man who demands absolute excellence, absolute, doing everything the right way. The only and not doing anything in a way that's superficial, not doing anything in a way that's inauthentic. Specifically, you need to know You, the Yaakov, you, the person who's inspired, who says like, I just want the real thing. I just want to be at the top. There's no such thing as being at the top without climbing that ladder. And therefore, the idea of Shalom Lishma is he's going to develop it a little bit more. But the idea of Shalom Lishma is the recognition that it's impossible as a human being with our own needs, our own desires, to recognize that we need to create some incentives for ourselves. It's okay to have people, to pat ourselves on the back, to have other people pat us on the back, to recognize that this is the normal human way to climb that ladder. Without it, we will not reach Lishma. We will not reach that top part of the ladder. And we should continue to take steps on that ladder, and we'll continue discussing this piece, God willing, soon.